The Australian soldier, climbing the muddy track toward Kokoda on July 23, 1942, stopped to catch his breath after ascending perhaps 100 yards of trail that rose at an angle approaching 45 degrees through jungle so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor, creating perpetual twilight even at midday and making navigation difficult despite the track being the only route through terrain that was otherwise completely impassable for troops carrying equipment and attempting to maintain any semblance of military formation. Private Bruce Kingsbury of the 214th Infantry Battalion, which had arrived at Port Moresby just days earlier, after serving in North Africa, where the battalion had fought at Tobruk and at El Alamein, carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment including his Lee Enfield rifle, 150 rounds of 303 ammunition distributed in pouches on his webbing, 4 hand grenades clipped to his belt, 2 water bottles that he had filled at the last stream crossing approximately 1 hour ago, 3 days' worth of tinned rations including bully beef and hardtack biscuits, a spare shirt and socks that were already soaked from the humidity despite being wrapped in a ground sheet, a blanket roll that would provide minimal protection from the cold at higher elevations where temperatures could drop to near freezing at night, and personal items including cigarettes, matches protected in a waterproof tin, letters from home that he read repeatedly during rest breaks, and photographs of his family back in Melbourne. The Kokoda Track, officially designated as a native footpath connecting Port Moresby on Papua's southern coast with the village of Kokoda, approximately 60 miles distant on the northern coastal plain, represented the only overland route across the Owen Stanley Range, a mountain chain that rose to elevations exceeding 7,000 feet and that formed a seemingly impassable barrier of jungle-covered peaks, steep ridges where trails clung to slopes at angles that made walking treacherous and made falls potentially fatal, and deep valleys where streams became raging torrents during rains, and where the humidity and the lack of air movement created conditions where even fit young soldiers became exhausted after brief periods of exertion. The track had been used for generations by native Papuans traveling between coastal villages and inland settlements, with the Papuans being accustomed to the terrain and being able to move along the track carrying substantial loads while wearing minimal clothing and while subsisting on foods that they gathered along the route or that they carried in small quantities. But the track had never been intended as military supply route, and it completely lacked the engineering improvements that would have made it suitable for moving the supplies, equipment, and reinforcements that modern armies required to sustain combat operations, with the track being barely wide enough in most sections to allow single-file movement, and being so narrow in some locations that soldiers had to turn sideways to pass between trees or rocks that encroached on the path, with grades in many sections exceeding 30 degrees and approaching 45 degrees in the steepest locations where soldiers climbing uphill had to use their hands to pull themselves up, using roots and trees as handholds, while those descending had to move slowly to avoid sliding uncontrollably down muddy slopes, and with river crossings that lacked bridges requiring soldiers to wade through swift currents while maintaining balance despite heavy loads and slippery rocks underfoot. The Kokoda campaign, beginning in July 1942, when Japanese forces landed at Gona and Buna on Papua's northern coast, and extending until January 1943, when the last Japanese resistance at Sanananda was finally crushed, represented Australia's most significant land campaign of World War II. The campaign that Australian military historians would later describe as the battle that saved Australia from potential Japanese invasion, and the campaign that would create national mythology about Australian soldiers fighting against overwhelming odds in terrain and conditions that tested human endurance beyond what most people could imagine. Port Moresby's strategic importance derived from its position as the only significant Allied base in New Guinea, from its airfields that could support operations against Japanese positions throughout the region, and from its potential use as staging base for Japanese invasion of northern Australia if Japan decided to pursue that strategic option after having achieved dominance throughout Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific during the first 6 months of the war. The terrain along the Kokoda track presented challenges that exceeded even the jungles of Burma or the mountains of Italy in the difficulties they created for military operations, with every aspect of the environment being actively hostile to human activity, and with survival requiring constant attention to threats that ranged from enemy action to diseases that could kill as surely as bullets, to simple exhaustion that could cause soldiers to collapse and die if they pushed beyond their physical limits. The jungle covering the mountains was primary rainforest, where trees reached heights exceeding 100 feet and created canopies so dense that ground-level vegetation was relatively sparse in some areas, though incredibly thick in others, where sunlight penetrated and where vines, ferns, and undergrowth created barriers that were impassable without cutting through with machetes. The climate combined heat, humidity, and rainfall in proportions that made the environment almost unbearable for soldiers from temperate regions who had never experienced tropical conditions and who found that their bodies could not adequately regulate temperature when ambient temperature exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity approached 100%, creating conditions where even moderate physical activity caused profuse sweating that led to dehydration despite drinking water continuously, where clothing became soaked with sweat within minutes of beginning movement, and where heat exhaustion became constant threat that claimed casualties almost as frequently as enemy fire did. The rain that fell almost daily during the campaign, with the Owen Stanley Range creating its own weather patterns where moisture-laden air rising from the coasts cooled as it climbed the mountains and released its moisture. As heavy rain that could continue for hours or even for days turned the track into mud that could be ankle-deep or even knee-deep in some sections, made footing treacherous on steep grades where one slip could send a soldier tumbling down slopes, and made everything perpetually wet, including clothing, equipment, rations, and weapons that had to be constantly cleaned and oiled to prevent rust and malfunction. The diseases that were endemic in Papua's environment created casualty rates that exceeded combat casualties throughout much of the campaign, with malaria being virtually universal among troops operating along the track, despite attempts to enforce anti-malarial discipline, including daily doses of quinine or atabrine that caused side effects including ringing in ears, yellowing of skin, and nausea that soldiers found almost as unpleasant as malaria itself. The malaria parasites transmitted by mosquitoes that bred in the countless pools of standing water throughout the jungle would enter bloodstreams and would remain dormant for days or weeks before causing attacks characterized by fever that could reach 105 degrees Fahrenheit, by chills so severe that soldiers shook uncontrollably even when wrapped in blankets, by sweating so profuse that clothing and bedding became soaked, and by weakness so complete that affected soldiers could not stand or walk without assistance. Dysentery caused by bacteria in food and water that had been contaminated by poor sanitation created diarrhea so severe that affected soldiers became dehydrated and weakened within days, with some cases being so severe that soldiers died from fluid loss if they could not receive proper medical treatment, including intravenous fluids that were generally unavailable at forward positions. Scrub typhus transmitted by mites living in kunai grass that covered some of the ridges along the track created high fevers, severe headaches, and rashes that could be fatal if untreated, with the disease being particularly dangerous because its symptoms were similar to other tropical fevers and because proper diagnosis required laboratory facilities that did not exist in forward areas. Tropical ulcers developed from minor cuts or scratches that became infected in the humid environment where bacteria thrived, and where keeping wounds clean was nearly impossible, with the ulcers growing larger if not properly treated, and sometimes reaching sizes of several inches in diameter, exposing bone, and creating injuries that required evacuation and extensive medical treatment to heal. Jungle rot affecting feet occurred when soldiers' feet remained constantly wet inside boots that could not dry in the humid environment, causing skin to soften and break down, and creating open sores that became infected and that made walking painful or impossible, with some soldiers being unable to continue operations because their feet were so damaged that they could not bear weight. The Japanese forces landing at Gona and Buna during July 21–22, 1942, consisted of approximately 13,000 troops organized as the South Seas Detachment under Major General Horii, a force that included the veteran 144th Infantry Regiment that had distinguished itself during the Malayan Campaign and at Singapore, where it had been among the first Japanese units to enter the city after British surrender, plus the 41st Infantry Regiment engineer units, including the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment that would be crucial for maintaining the track during Japanese advance, and approximately 2,500 naval troops who would establish base at Kokoda and who would secure the line of communications back to the coast. The Japanese forces possessed significant advantages, including extensive combat experience from campaigns in China, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, training specifically for jungle warfare that emphasized rapid movement and infiltration tactics, and demonstrated ability to operate on minimal logistics that would prove crucial when supply lines stretched over the mountains and when carrier capacity became the limiting factor for sustaining operations. General Horii was an experienced officer who understood both the opportunities and the risks of the operation he was commanding, recognizing that capturing Port Moresby would give Japan a base for threatening northern Australia and would eliminate the Allied base that posed the greatest threat to Japanese positions in eastern New Guinea, but also understanding that advancing over the Owen Stanley Range would stretch supply lines to their limits and would require his forces to operate far from support under conditions where defeat might result in complete destruction of his command, because retreat over the mountains while being pursued by enemy forces would be catastrophic. Horii's orders from higher headquarters were unambiguous, directing him to advance rapidly to Port Moresby and to capture the town before Australian reinforcements could arrive, reflecting Japanese strategic thinking that emphasized speed and aggressive action, and that accepted risks that more cautious commanders might have considered unacceptable. The Australian forces defending the Kokoda track when Japanese invasion began consisted primarily of a single militia battalion, the 39th Battalion, which numbered approximately 480 all ranks when it departed Port Moresby in early July 1942, with orders to garrison Kokoda and to maintain patrol presence along the track, with the battalion not expecting to face major combat operations and not being equipped or trained for sustained fighting against experienced Japanese forces. The 39th Battalion had been raised in Victoria during 1941 from volunteers who were too young or who were in reserved occupations that exempted them from service in the Australian Imperial Force, which was the regular army that deployed overseas, with the militia being restricted by law to service within Australia and its territories, including Papua, which was technically Australian territory, though it was administered separately. The battalion's troops averaged perhaps 19 or 20 years of age, with many being straight out of school or from farms where they had worked before enlisting, with their military training consisting of perhaps 6 months of basic instruction that had emphasized parade ground drill and basic rifle handling more than tactical training or physical conditioning for jungle operations. The battalion's equipment was minimal by standards of fully equipped infantry battalions, lacking medium machine guns and mortars heavier than 2-inch models that were essentially useless for defensive fires, lacking adequate radios for communication between companies and with higher headquarters, lacking adequate medical supplies for treating casualties in jungle environment where even minor wounds could become life-threatening if infections developed, and most critically lacking the combat experience and the psychological preparation for facing Japanese forces that had developed fearsome reputation through their victories during the first 6 months of the war. Lieutenant Colonel William Owen, commanding the 39th Battalion, understood that his force was inadequate for the mission it was being given, but accepted orders with the professionalism that characterized Australian officers, even when orders seemed to demand the impossible, and attempted to prepare his battalion for combat through additional training during the march to Kokoda and through establishing defensive positions at Kokoda that might allow the battalion to delay Japanese advance even if holding permanently was impossible. Owen was a World War I veteran who had served on the Western Front and who understood infantry combat from personal experience, but who recognized that jungle warfare in Papua would be fundamentally different from trench warfare in France, and who worried that his young soldiers would not be able to adapt quickly enough when combat began. The initial contact between Australian and Japanese forces occurred on July 23rd at Awala, a small village approximately 10 miles from Kokoda along the track leading from the coast, when a platoon from B Company of the 39th Battalion under Lieutenant Alan McPhee encountered Japanese advance guard consisting of approximately 50 to 60 troops from the Yanomori 4th Regiment's advance party. The contact began around 1400 hours when McPhee's platoon, which was conducting reconnaissance patrol checking reports that Japanese forces had landed at Gona and were advancing inland, spotted Japanese soldiers on the track ahead and opened fire from ambush positions approximately 50 yards from the Japanese column. The firefight lasted approximately 30 minutes, with the Australian platoon firing from positions in jungle alongside the track, while Japanese forces attempted to locate the Australian positions and attempted to outflank them by sending groups through the jungle to attack from the sides. McPhee's platoon inflicted several casualties on the Japanese, seeing at least 3 Japanese soldiers fall and not rise again, but began taking casualties themselves when Japanese return fire became more accurate and when Japanese forces began maneuvering to outflank the position. McPhee ordered withdrawal after perhaps 20 minutes of fighting when it became clear that his 30-man platoon was facing forces that significantly outnumbered him and that possessed heavier weapons, including light machine guns, that were suppressing his positions, with the withdrawal being conducted in reasonable order, with sections leapfrogging back along the track while maintaining fire on Japanese positions to discourage pursuit. The platoon reached Kokoda around 1800 hours, having suffered 4 casualties, including 1 man killed and 3 wounded, with one of the wounded being serious enough that he required immediate evacuation to Port Moresby for surgery, and with the rest of the platoon being exhausted from the firefight and from the rapid movement back to Kokoda over track that required climbing several hundred feet in elevation. Lieutenant McPhee reported to Colonel Owen that Japanese forces were advancing along the track in at least company strength and possibly battalion strength based on the volume of fire that had been directed at his platoon and based on the organized manner in which Japanese forces had attempted to outflank his position, and recommended that the battalion prepare defensive positions immediately, because Japanese attack on Kokoda could come within 24 to 48 hours. Owen accepted McPhee's assessment and ordered the battalion to prepare defensive positions around Kokoda, utilizing the slight elevation that the village occupied and utilizing existing buildings, including the mission station and the native huts, as strong points that could be defended, though Owen recognized that the positions were far from ideal, because the jungle came close to the village on all sides and provided covered approaches that Japanese forces could use to get close before being detected. The defensive preparations were hampered by shortage of entrenching tools that would have allowed proper construction of fighting positions, by shortage of wire for obstacles that might channel Japanese attacks into killing zones, and by shortage of time because the work had to be completed before Japanese forces arrived, and while soldiers also had to maintain patrols watching for Japanese approach and had to prepare rations and maintain equipment. The battle for Kokoda village began during the early morning hours of July 29th, when Japanese forces that had advanced from Awala during July 28th and that had established positions in jungle surrounding Kokoda launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions against Australian positions that were manned by perhaps 300 troops from the 39th Battalion, with remainder of the battalion being deployed along the track toward Port Moresby, or being at the airfield that had been cleared near Kokoda, and that was supposed to allow reinforcement and resupply by air, though the airfield's utility had proven limited, because it could accommodate only small aircraft, and because weather frequently made flying impossible. The Japanese attacks employed tactics that the 144th Regiment had perfected during previous campaigns, with frontal attacks pinning Australian defenders in their positions, while other Japanese forces infiltrated through jungle to attack from flanks and rear, creating confusion and preventing Australian forces from establishing coherent defensive line where mutual support could be effective. The fighting continued through July 29th, with the intensity increasing as more Japanese forces arrived, and as Japanese commanders committed reserves to maintain pressure on Australian defenders who were being steadily pushed back from their initial positions toward the center of the village. Colonel Owen was killed during the afternoon of July 29th, shot by Japanese rifle fire while attempting to organize counterattack against Japanese forces that had penetrated the perimeter and that were threatening to split the Australian position into isolated groups that could be destroyed separately. Owen's death was particularly damaging because it deprived the battalion of its commander at the critical moment when leadership and experience were most needed, with the battalion's second in command, Captain Sam Templeton, assuming command but lacking Owen's experience and lacking his familiarity with the tactical situation that had been developing over several days of fighting. The Australian withdrawal from Kokoda was ordered by Templeton during the evening of July 29th, after it became clear that the position could not be held against Japanese forces that had demonstrated superior numbers, superior firepower, and superior tactical competence, with the withdrawal being conducted during darkness to minimize casualties and to prevent Japanese forces from pursuing too closely. The withdrawal route followed the track toward Port Moresby, with the battalion moving in column with rearguard sections, maintaining contact with Japanese forces and delaying their pursuit, while the main body moved as rapidly as possible given the terrain and the darkness that made movement along the track dangerous. The reinforcements that began arriving at Port Moresby during early August included veteran battalions from the 7th Division that had fought in North Africa and that possessed the combat experience and training that militia battalions lacked, with the 214th Battalion and the 216th Battalion being among the first to arrive and being immediately sent forward along the track to reinforce the militia battalions and to establish defensive positions where Japanese advance might be halted before it reached positions where Port Moresby would be directly threatened. Private Kingsbury's battalion, the 214th, which had been fighting at El Alamein just weeks earlier, and which had been withdrawn from North Africa specifically to defend against Japanese threat to Australia, marched from Port Moresby toward the forward positions during early August, carrying full combat loads and expecting to engage Japanese forces within days of reaching the fighting zone. The march from Port Moresby to the forward positions required approximately 1 week of continuous movement along the track, with the battalion covering perhaps 8 to 10 miles per day, depending on terrain and on how often rest breaks were necessary to allow soldiers to recover from the exhaustion that came from climbing mountains while carrying 60-pound loads in heat and humidity that made every step an ordeal. The soldiers from the 214th Battalion who had fought in North Africa found that desert warfare had not prepared them for jungle conditions, with many initially believing that jungle fighting would be easier than desert fighting because water was abundant rather than scarce, and because shade from the jungle canopy protected them from direct sun, but quickly learning that jungle presented different challenges, including the exhaustion from climbing mountains, the constant wetness that rotted equipment and skin, the leeches that attached to exposed skin and that had to be burned off, and the diseases that began affecting soldiers within days of entering the jungle, despite anti-malarial discipline and despite attempts to maintain sanitation. The defensive positions at Isurava, established during late August at a point approximately 15 miles from Kokoda toward Port Moresby, and at elevation of approximately 5,000 feet where the track crossed a ridge offering some defensive advantages, would become the site of the most significant fighting during the Japanese advance phase, with Australian forces, including elements of the 214th Battalion, the 216th Battalion, and the 39th Battalion attempting to hold positions that had been prepared over several days and that represented the strongest defensive line that Australian forces had established since withdrawing from Kokoda. The position occupied a ridge where the track crossed from one valley into another, with the ridge providing observation over approaches from both directions and providing fields of fire that were better than most positions along the track, though still limited by jungle to perhaps 50 to 100 yards in most directions. Private Kingsbury's company from the 214th Battalion occupied positions on the left flank of the defensive line, positions that covered a secondary track that intelligence suggested might be used by Japanese forces attempting to outflank the main position, with the company being deployed with 2 platoons forward and 1 in reserve, and with company headquarters being positioned in a small clearing, where the company commander could coordinate defensive fires and could maintain communication with battalion headquarters via radio that worked intermittently when atmospheric conditions allowed transmission. The company's defensive positions included shallow trenches that had been dug over 2 days of preparation work, with the digging being extremely difficult in the rocky soil and in the roots that penetrated the ground throughout the jungle, and included some obstacles consisting of fallen logs positioned to create barriers that would slow attacking forces and would channel them into areas where defensive fires could be most effective. The Japanese attack at Isurava began on August 26th, with probing attacks that tested Australian defenses and that attempted to identify weak points that could be exploited during subsequent attacks, with small groups of Japanese soldiers advancing toward Australian positions and withdrawing when they encountered fire, repeating the process multiple times during the day, while Japanese commanders observed where fire came from and how Australian forces responded to threats. The main Japanese assault began during the pre-dawn hours of August 29th, when Japanese forces launched coordinated attacks against multiple points along the Australian defensive line, with the attacks being supported by mortar fire that had been registered during previous days through observation of Australian positions. The attack on Kingsbury's company position began around 04:30 hours, when Japanese mortar fire began falling on the company's forward platoon positions, with the shells detonating in the trees above the trenches and creating air bursts that scattered shrapnel over wide areas and that caused casualties among soldiers who were in trenches that provided protection from ground-level explosions, but that were inadequate for protection from shells detonating overhead. The mortar bombardment lasted approximately 15 minutes before lifting, with the lifting being the signal for Japanese infantry assault that came almost immediately after the last mortar rounds fell, and that caught some Australian soldiers still recovering from the bombardment rather than being fully alert and prepared to engage attacking forces. The Japanese infantry advancing through the jungle toward Australian positions moved in small groups, maintaining intervals that prevented one burst of fire from hitting multiple soldiers, with the soldiers advancing rapidly when they were in covered terrain and moving more slowly when they had to cross open areas or areas where Australian fire was likely. The advancing Japanese soldiers fired rifles and threw grenades as they moved, creating volume of fire that kept Australian defenders in their trenches and that prevented them from establishing effective defensive fires that might have stopped the attack before it reached the Australian positions. The sound of the attack was overwhelming, with rifle fire, grenade explosions, shouting from both sides, and the screams of wounded creating cacophony that made verbal communication nearly impossible, and that created confusion about what was happening even among soldiers who were directly engaged in the fighting. Kingsbury, who was positioned with a Bren light machine gun that had been allocated to his section as the primary support weapon, began firing short bursts at Japanese soldiers who were visible approximately 40 to 50 yards from his position, with the bursts being deliberately short to conserve ammunition and to prevent the gun from overheating, which could cause stoppages that would take precious seconds to clear. The Bren gun fired .303 ammunition from 30-round magazines that could be emptied in seconds if the gun was fired continuously, with Kingsbury having perhaps 10 magazines immediately available, meaning he had approximately 300 rounds before having to reload from ammunition boxes that were positioned behind his trench, and with each magazine change requiring perhaps 5 seconds during which the gun was not firing and during which Japanese forces could advance without being engaged. The penetration of the Australian line occurred approximately 30 minutes after the attack began, when a group of perhaps 20 to 30 Japanese soldiers infiltrated between Kingsbury's section and the adjacent section, exploiting a gap in the defensive line that had been created when casualties reduced the defending force, and when the remaining defenders concentrated their fire on threats directly to their front rather than maintaining observation on their flanks. The Japanese forces that achieved penetration immediately exploited it by moving into the Australian rear area and by attacking Australian positions from behind, creating crisis that threatened to collapse the entire defensive position and that required immediate response if the position was to be held. Kingsbury's response, which would earn him Australia's first Victoria Cross of the Pacific War, was to charge the Japanese position alone while firing his Bren gun from the hip, an action that contradicted all training about proper employment of light machine guns, which emphasized firing from stable positions where accuracy could be maximized, but that achieved tactical effect by surprising Japanese forces who had not expected counterattack and by killing several Japanese soldiers before they could respond effectively to threat from unexpected direction. Kingsbury continued his charge despite being wounded by Japanese fire, reaching the Japanese position and clearing it through close range fire, and through his aggressive action that prevented Japanese forces from consolidating their penetration, and that allowed other Australian soldiers to counterattack and to restore the defensive line. Kingsbury was killed by Japanese fire shortly after clearing the penetration, shot multiple times while attempting to return to his own positions, falling on the track approximately 20 yards from where he had begun his charge, and dying almost immediately from wounds that were immediately fatal. His body was recovered after the fighting by his comrades, who carried it to rear areas for burial, with the company commander recommending Kingsbury for highest decoration based on eyewitness accounts from soldiers who had observed the action and who credited Kingsbury with preventing collapse of the defensive position through his courage and through his decisive action at the critical moment. The Victoria Cross would be awarded posthumously, being presented to Kingsbury's family after the war, with citation describing his actions and recognizing his sacrifice as representative of the courage that Australian soldiers displayed throughout the Kokoda campaign. The fighting at Isurava continued through August 31st, with Japanese forces maintaining pressure on Australian positions despite casualties they had suffered, with the attacks being pressed with determination that accepted losses in exchange for maintaining momentum and for preventing Australian forces from stabilizing defensive line that might have halted Japanese advance for extended period. The Australian withdrawal from Isurava on August 31st was conducted under pressure from Japanese forces that pursued closely, with rearguard actions being fought at multiple points along the track, as Australian forces fell back toward positions at Brigade Hill and at Efogee, where they attempted to establish new defensive lines. The casualties at Isurava exceeded 100 Australian soldiers killed, including Kingsbury, and numerous other soldiers whose sacrifice delayed Japanese advance and inflicted casualties on attacking forces, and approximately 300 wounded, with many of the wounded requiring evacuation along the track to Port Moresby, where medical facilities could provide proper treatment. The wounded were carried along the track by native carriers who formed stretcher teams, with 4 carriers being required for each stretcher, and with the carriers having to navigate the same difficult terrain that was challenging for unencumbered soldiers while carrying wounded, who needed to be kept as stable as possible to prevent additional injury. Japanese casualties at Isurava were estimated at approximately 200 killed and perhaps 500 wounded, based on observations of Japanese casualties visible in areas that had been contested and based on prisoner interrogations that provided information about Japanese unit strengths and losses. The furthest point of Japanese advance came at Ioribaiwa Ridge during mid-September, approximately 30 miles from Port Moresby, measured along the track, and perhaps 20 miles in direct distance, where Australian forces established defensive positions with orders to hold at all costs, because further withdrawal would leave Port Moresby directly vulnerable to Japanese attack and would create possibility that the town could fall before reinforcements could arrive from Australia. The positions at Ioribaiwa occupied a ridge approximately 3,000 feet in elevation, lower than positions at Isurava, but still high enough that nights were cold and that soldiers required blankets for warmth, with the ridge providing good observation toward the north, where Japanese forces would approach, and providing defensive advantages that might allow smaller forces to hold against larger attacking forces if positions were properly prepared and if supplies and ammunition could be maintained. But the Japanese offensive had culminated by mid-September, with Japanese forces being exhausted from weeks of continuous combat and from the advance over the mountains that had tested even the experienced and physically fit soldiers of the 144th Regiment, with supply lines being stretched beyond capacity to deliver adequate supplies, with carriers being unable to bring forward enough food and ammunition to sustain combat operations at the intensity that would be required to break through Australian defenses, and with casualties from combat and from disease having reduced Japanese combat strength from approximately 13,000 at the campaign's beginning to perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 effectives who were capable of continued operations. General Horii recognized that continuing offensive operations was impossible without resupply and reinforcements, and received orders from higher headquarters to withdraw to positions closer to the coast where supply would be easier, and where Japanese forces could establish defenses against anticipated Australian counteroffensives. The Japanese withdrawal from WWII, beginning on September 24th, was initially conducted in organized fashion, with rear guards establishing positions that delayed Australian pursuit and with main forces withdrawing along the track in column formation, maintaining discipline despite the retreat's hardships. But the withdrawal became increasingly difficult as Australian forces pursued aggressively and as supply situation deteriorated to point where Japanese soldiers were starving and where disease incapacitated men faster than combat had. The retreat over the mountains toward Kokoda and toward the coastal positions at Gona and Buna became ordeal that killed thousands of Japanese soldiers through starvation, disease, exhaustion, and through Australian attacks on retreating columns. The Australian pursuit beginning from WWII during late September and continuing through November. As Australian forces advanced back over the track, they had retreated along during August, and September reversed the campaign's direction but did not reduce its difficulty, with Australian forces now facing the same supply challenges that Japanese forces had faced during their advance, and with the track being in even worse condition after months of military traffic, and after Japanese forces had destroyed bridges and had created obstacles attempting to slow Australian pursuit. The recapture of Kokoda on November 2nd by Australian forces represented symbolic victory that demonstrated the threat to Port Moresby had been eliminated and the Japanese forces were being driven back toward their coastal bases, though significant fighting remained as Japanese forces established strong defensive positions at Gona, Buna, and Sanananda, where they would resist Australian and American attacks for 2 more months before being finally destroyed in fighting that was as intense as anything that had occurred on the track. The final operations at Gona Buna Sanananda during November 1942 through January 1943 saw Australian forces that had pursued Japanese over the mountains being joined by American forces, including the 32nd Division that had been deployed to Papua, and that would conduct its first combat operations against Japanese defensive positions that had been fortified extensively and that were defended by approximately 6,500 Japanese troops, who were determined to resist to the death rather than surrendering. The fighting in the coastal area was characterized by Japanese positions being constructed in coconut log bunkers that were virtually impervious to small arms fire and that required tanks or artillery for destruction, with the positions being mutually supporting and being connected by communication trenches that allowed Japanese forces to maneuver between positions while remaining under cover. The casualties during the entire Kokoda campaign from July 1942 through January 1943 totaled approximately 625 Australian soldiers killed and approximately 1,600 wounded, with an additional several thousand being evacuated due to disease, including malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus that incapacitated them for combat operations. Every Australian soldier who served on the track contracted malaria at least once, with many experiencing multiple attacks, including relapses that occurred months or years after initial infection. Japanese casualties exceeded 13,000, with approximately 2,000 being killed in combat and approximately 10,000 dying from disease, starvation, and exhaustion during the retreat and during the final battles at the coast, with only approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers being captured alive, and with the remainder dying in action or from the conditions that made the campaign one of the most lethal of the entire war, measured by the percentage of participants who became casualties. The Kokoda track campaign established Australian military tradition and created national mythology about the Kokoda spirit of soldiers fighting against overwhelming odds in defense of their homeland, with the campaign being commemorated annually and with the track itself becoming pilgrimage site where Australians walked to honor those who fought and died during the campaign. The campaign demonstrated that jungle warfare required not just tactical skill, but also extraordinary physical endurance, ability to operate on minimal logistics, and willingness to accept hardships that tested human limits while maintaining discipline and combat effectiveness, despite conditions that would justify collapse.